Welcome back to Fresh Outlook, everybody. I'm Logan Crawford. A police officer shoots and kills a teenager in a major American suburban city. We all know the name of that community by now. It is Ferguson. Many said the cop killed the teen because he was black, but multiple investigations, including a federal investigation, cleared the officer of any wrongdoing. However, during the course of the investigations, the Justice Department says it discovered a disturbing pattern of prejudice by the Ferguson Police Department. Take a look.
This week brought fresh news from Ferguson, Missouri, the city which suffered notable civil unrest after Michael Brown was shot down by police officer Darren Wilson. Since the riots, 2 investigations were launched by the Justice Department. The first looked into the shooting itself, the second into the Ferguson Police Department. On the shooting itself, the finding concluded there was no case against the one individual officer. The investigation concluded that Wilson did not shoot Brown in the back as he was running away, that Brown did stop and turn towards Wilson. Furthermore, claims that Brown had his hands in the air as a sign of surrender were found to be not supported by the physical and forensic evidence. The second report made scathing criticism of the system in which that officer operated, laid against the backdrop of a community which is deeply polarized and where exists a deep distrust between the police and the residents.
It's not difficult to imagine how a single tragic incident set off the city of Ferguson like a powder keg.
Furthermore, the Justice Department on Ferguson's police department says that its practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than public safety needs. The Department of Justice has issued recommendations to the Ferguson Police Department and the Municipal Court on ways to resolve the problems plaguing the community.
And we are back live on set here at Fresh Outlook. I am joined by the Ebru think tank, Yohuru Williams of Fairfield University, Donald Tibbs of Drexel University, and Robert Chase of Stony Brook University. And Donald, I'll begin with you.
Sure.
What's the walkaway message right now on Ferguson?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin with the walkaway message? The walkaway message, I think, right now in Ferguson is that the police need to be more conscientious about how they treat African Americans in the context of policing, but not just African Americans, perhaps all citizens. The storyline that we've actually learned from Ferguson is that we don't have as much of a racial problem as we do a policing problem. And this policing problem is one that is historically rooted in racial animus, and it has been driving what policing looks like as well as our constitutional law dating all the way back to slavery. So if we want to really take a look at Ferguson and ask ourselves, what do we learn from Ferguson? It is that our police officers and police departments need to be working better with the communities that they serve.
Robert, one of the things that came out of Ferguson was this report by the Department of Justice. While it cleared the cop of any wrongdoing, they did say there was a pattern of prejudice within the community. Is this commonplace? Does it happen just in Ferguson? Does it happen everywhere?
One of the most amazing things about this report is that it did the kind of deep social work that historians or social scientists or legal scholars would do. And it provided us with a picture that we normally otherwise would not see. The kind of work that a historian might do when we're doing the autopsy of a place. And what we learned was that a population of 67% is being arrested, I mean the African American population, at rates of 90, 95%, cases of canines, 100%. And while we're remembering the moment of the civil rights movement and Selma and the use of dogs by Bull Connor, here we have a moment in which African Americans continue to face these kinds of moments of violence by the police, and yet it goes undocumented. And what the Justice Department did is make that connection clear. So to also build on my colleague Professor Tibbs's point, this is directly related to the civil rights movement, directly, and we are seeing a new civil rights movement. And I think it's important to note one other fact, which is that the number of African Americans who have been incarcerated has gotten worse since the civil rights movement, not better. In 1954, on the eve of Brown versus Board of Education, African Americans were incarcerated at 4 times the rate of whites. Today, that number is closer to 7 times the rate of whites. So this is indeed a civil rights issue, as incarceration strips people of the right to vote, yet makes them representative of congressional representation and changes the dynamic of the political scene.
And also from a very young age, Yohuru, young black men in particular getting caught up in the criminal justice system that they are not able to maneuver or manipulate like some. That they're hit with fines, they're given a criminal record, they're not able to get a regular job after getting that criminal record for minor offenses at times, for having a small quantity of marijuana, for example. Do you think the black community is purposely being perpetrated, these offenses are being perpetrated on them by the ruling class?
Absolutely, and I think that this report speaks directly to that by talking about implicit and explicit racism that was occurring in Ferguson. I think the other thing is that, you know, there have been a lot of attempts to connect this, and I think Rob does a very good job of connecting it to the legacy of the civil rights movement. For me, the Ferguson Report will be, in many ways, almost like a new Kerner Commission report, because it documents how we really are, at least in terms of criminal justice, and certainly in other areas, two societies separate and unequal. And we saw how that played out on the ground in Ferguson in terms of the apportionment of fines, the policing of the communities of black and brown bodies. The great thing about this moment is that it is encouraging dialogue. In Connecticut, for example, they're just putting together a statewide panel to look at policing. But you have people in Ferguson saying we've got to keep the pressure on, and across the country saying we've got to keep the pressure on. We've got to broaden the discussion to talk about many things that both Professor Tibbs and Professor Chase talked about. Because if we don't take into account the issue of mass incarceration, if we don't look at the issue of poverty, selling Lucy's on the streets of Staten Island is presumably what led to the Eric Garner case, but race informed that interaction between he and the police. So that's the larger takeaway, I think, for all of us, is that we've got to deal with the underlying issues that make this such a racialized issue.
Well, it's interesting. Somebody said to me, and it stuck with me a long time ago, that the people in Greenwich, Connecticut are committing the same crimes that the people in the ghetto are, except nobody kicks in their front door. Do you agree with something like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the way that crime is spread across the country is not something that exists primarily in one community. Crime, the selling of drugs, the drug usage. In fact, drug usage may be higher in some white communities than it may actually be in poor urban African-American communities. The difference is how policing occurs, right? So if the police are patrolling African-American communities at a greater rate, then you're going to find greater incidences of crime in those communities. It doesn't mean that there actually is more crime, it's just that there's more executions of arrests, there's more stops, there's more frisks, there's more sort of prevalence of the police and the police force in that community. So that becomes a real issue, right? It becomes a real issue in terms of how the law actually operates, and it becomes a real issue that leads to things like massive incarceration.
Yohuru, let me play devil's advocate for just a second, because I've been hearing this a lot from commentators on TV, particularly people like Jeanine Pirro on Fox, who says black people need to take responsibility for what's happening in their own communities, that there's not enough fathers, that there's too much drug use, you need to pull up your pants. I mean, I'm just parroting what they say. Do they have a point?
They do not have a point in connecting it to this particular issue, because the whole question of the responsibility of the African-American community to deal with crime is actually taken on in the Ferguson Report, because it's not like communities of color aren't asking for the involvement of law enforcement. What they're getting, however, is a response that's more militaristic than it is community partnership.
And a perfect example of that was down, I believe, in the Dallas area. A woman called the police to get help for her mentally disturbed son.
Exactly.
And literally within 5 seconds, they shot him dead.
Yes.
Correct.
He came out, he had a screwdriver in his hand, he was talking to the cops. Immediately they began screaming, drop it, drop it, drop it, drop it, drop it. Nobody would know what to do in that situation, and he was killed in a hail of bullets.
Right.
In the Justice Department report itself was an instance of a woman who called because her boyfriend was abusing her. The result of that call and having and relying on the police department was for them to come into her home and then, rather than help her, give her a violation, a housing violation, because apparently it looked as if the boyfriend lived in the house, and that was a violation under housing authority. So this is a deep problem if the African American community can't even have a moment of assistance from the police department, and every encounter, whether it be small or large, results in some kind of fine, some kind of arrest, some kind of negative altercation. And when we look at the numbers nationally, we know that African Americans are incarcerated at 6 times the rates of whites. And we have a nation that has 5% of the world's general population, yet 25% of its prison population. We incarcerate more people than any country in the world. And the people that we incarcerate are, by and large, people of color, African Americans, and Latinos. So I think that this is a deep-seated racial problem in terms of where we police, how we police, and the results of policing.
Let me add to that. That narrative of pull your pants up is really like the Moynihan Report from 1965, which blames the victims. But when you have a system of policing that penalizes communities in this way, who's responsible for the breakdown of the black family? Look first at the cycle of poverty, then look at the removal of mothers and fathers from homes for minor crimes. I mean, this is what's contributing to this, and we've got to deal with the underlying issues. Or again, as Rob pointed out, this is simply a cyclical conversation that goes on because we're not addressing those deep structural inequalities.
Absolutely. Donald, let me ask you a little bit about the Eric Garner case. Do you
Sure.
see any similarities with the Michael Brown case? And also, let me give you a compound question here. Do you think the grand jury got it wrong with Michael Brown?
Yes, I think the grand jury did get it wrong with Michael Brown, and I think the grand jury definitely got it wrong with Eric Garner. I don't think there's a
absolutely
question
agree with
about
that. I mean, you saw this man
and part of the reason that I think that the grand jury got it wrong is because once an individual purports under law that they want to put on a particular defense, the burden of proof is on them to prove that defense. So essentially what Officer Darren Wilson was saying in the Michael Brown case is that I had to shoot Michael Brown in self-defense. That's an affirmative defense under law, which means now the burden shifts from the state to you to prove the elements of your defense, which means you have to come into a court of law and essentially allow that case to actually bear out. So the grand jury, I think, had enough evidence in front of them in order to warrant an indictment from the against Officer Wilson. Securing an indictment from a grand jury to find probable cause that there has been a homicide is relatively easy to do, particularly when the person admits to committing the homicide. There's the probable cause right there. So I do think the grand jury got it wrong.
I'm going to give you the final word, Robert. What's the takeaway from the Ferguson? Do we have a silver lining here? The fact that this report has come out, that people can actually say it's been documented that black people are treated differently than white people?
First, we need a report like the one that we have in Ferguson in almost every major urban municipality in the country, because much of the fact is that we don't know. We don't know the number of shootings that police officers undertake against black citizens because they're generally not reported to the FBI crime reports. It's a voluntary report. So first, we need more data. Florida hasn't reported, for instance, since 1996. Second, though, I would say that for me, the silver lining is in terms of who votes. In 2012 in Ferguson, according to one study, African Americans at the national election voted approximately at the same level of whites, 55 to 54%. But in the municipal level in 2013, their numbers dropped significantly, and it looks as if whites went to the polls 3 times the rate of African Americans.
I'm going to hold you there because we're running out of time. One answer to all of this, of course, with the police, in part at least, are civilian review boards. I'd like to thank Dr. Tibbs for joining us, Yohuru Williams, Robert Chase as well. That is it for this edition of Fresh Outlook, Ebru-TV talk show that does what else? Help you keep your fresh outlook fresh and informed. I'm Logan Crawford. Thanks for joining us.